able to speak as the public? Thank you. I know, but the 4 o'clock thing scared me a little bit.
Oh, no, actually, I should clarify. We're gonna go now.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Curt Bramble. I'm the sponsor, or was a sponsor in 2019 in the state of Utah of the first Kratom Consumer Protection Act. And to answer Representative Baldwin's question that he hasn't asked yet, I have no financial interest in the Kratom industry, okay? What I do have is I'm father of 6, been married 46 years. Our middle daughter, we have 3 boys, 3 girls. She and her high school sweetheart, both gifted athletes, they were injured when they were in high school, prescription pain medications, typical story. They go to college, they got married, prescription pain medication led to prescription abuse, led to drug use, led to heroin, led to jail. My son-in-law died of an opioid overdose. And had I known about Kratom at the time, the outcome may have been a bit different, given all of the testimony, all of the science. When I was first approached by the American Kratom Association, and I readily recognized it was AKA that asked me to run legislation in Utah in 2018. I rejected it. I got online, I looked, found all of the information that's been cited here in the committee today, from the FDA, the CDC, the Mayo Clinic, etc. But then I did a deep dive, and I found that there was a great deal more information. The National Institute of Drug Abuse, you heard from one of their key scientists earlier today, Dr. Jack Henningfield. They are charged with the investigation, and they're really the scientific arm that the DEA relies on for whether something should be prohibited, whether it should be scheduled. The DEA rejected it. NIDA has made it clear that the vast majority, well, I can read directly from their website. They say, relative to Kratom, and I'll quote, "Compared to deaths from other drugs, a very small number of deaths have been linked to Kratom products, and nearly all cases involved other drugs or contaminants." What we found is, in virtually every case, and this has played out across the country and around the world. I've had occasion to go to Indonesia several times. I've met with the Indonesian government. I've met with folks, scientists and professionals, literally throughout the world on Kratom. In virtually every case where there's an adverse outcome, and this played out here. You heard some testimony. Representative Brooks, I believe my recollection of the committee hearing 2 years ago from your state toxicology lab, or whatever the technical name is, said that every case of an OWI where Kratom was present, there was other substances in their test that they didn't find one OWI where Kratom was a sole antagonist. And that has played out time and time and time again. The only cases where Kratom is viewed as the sole substance have been anecdotal. As a policymaker, I've been searching, looking for the cases where we have evidence, empirical, quantifiable evidence, where Kratom was a sole substance and what the cause of death was. The problem with Kratom is that and this has played out in Utah, Kratom is easily adulterated. You heard from a witness that Kratom causes intoxication. Well, you heard from Dr. Jack Henningfield that Kratom does not create the mental impairment. There is no evidence of respiratory depression. There certainly is no euphoric high from taking Kratom. But the problem is, for bad actors in the marketplace, they will lace Kratom with fentanyl, benzodiazepine. The 9 deaths that were referred to, that's what started the FDA down there, saying that Kratom is a dangerous opioid. It was a product that was laced with O-desmethyl tramadol, synthetic tramadol, all bought from the same online vendor. The product was called Krypton. But in every case that we've found, it's been adulterated Kratom. So it made sense to say that Kratom ought to be subject to the same type of regulation that even a bottle of water. If I go to a convenience store here in Wisconsin, I buy a bottle of water, that bottle of water is required to be labeled, it's required to have ingredients, it's required to have a batch number. Kratom was completely unregulated, and so what we did, we said that it ought to be registered with the state, there ought to be a certificate of analysis, it should be sold only behind the counter, and it should be properly labeled with appropriate warnings. So, Mr. Chair, I'd encourage you to give careful consideration. The opportunity to have Kratom available, NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the one agency that DEA looks to say what should be scheduled, what should not be, they will tell you, the scientists and their official position is that Kratom should not be scheduled. It should be available because the potential benefit to the public versus the detriment if Kratom is prohibited is substantial. So thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is James Carroll. You should be somewhat afraid. I am an attorney. I'm from Washington, D.C. I'm here to help. For 3 years, I served as the director of an agency inside the White House called the Office of National Drug Control Policy. It's a position known informally as the U.S. Drug Czar. And in that capacity, I oversaw the $36 billion the federal government spends on drug issues. So that includes overseeing the entire DEA, all of our Customs and Border Protection agents that are involved in stopping the illicit flow of drugs into our country, as well as HHS for the treatment side, Department of Education for prevention, a total of 17 departments and agencies within the federal government. In that role, I was fortunate to be unanimously confirmed because it is considered to be, should be a nonpartisan position. I started my career as a criminal prosecutor, as a drug prosecutor in Virginia. And you can find no one harder on crime than me. I'm also the father of a daughter who is in recovery from an addiction to opioids. And there was mention earlier about the Sackler family and how the Sacklers hid the information. I can tell you for a fact the FDA, and you can read this in pretty much any of the articles, any of the books that have been written about this, the FDA licensed opioids knowing the addictive quality of it. So the fact that the FDA got it wrong, quite frankly, is nothing new. And I can tell you that from my own personal experience, as well as the probably 1 million people that have died in the past 15 years from opioid addictions that started with a prescription. In Wisconsin, in the last 3 years since I left office, opioid overdoses or drug overdoses, fatal overdoses have increased 50%. But I'm here to talk not just as a lawyer, I'm actually here as a fact witness. I'm not a scientist, I don't pretend to be one. And as a lawyer, I'm essentially paid by the hour, so we can go all night. Would be more than happy to talk about this. I'm here as a fact witness because I was the U.S. Drug Czar when the FDA came to me to request scheduling of Kratom. And I want to sort of explain some of the background that I was given at that point. At that point, I was not very familiar with Kratom. I had heard of it. I'd seen the neon signs at a vaping store, and that was pretty much the extent of which I knew about it. The FDA came and said, much of what you heard, much of what you read today on Google, is that it is fatal. It's causes respiratory distress and is able to decrease your ability to breathe. They gave a pretty compelling argument. And shortly after that, and I was fortunate, we had a very good working relationship at the point with the DEA, with the DEA administrator, and the Assistant Secretary for Health, Dr. Brett Giroir, who was mentioned earlier. Brett was, as the Assistant Secretary for Health, was the Chief Medical Officer inside HHS. He set the policy. U.S. Surgeon General reports and the entire Public Health Corps reports to the Assistant Secretary for Health. Shortly after the FDA left, I knew they were headed over to meet with the DEA administrator. The Assistant Secretary for Health called me and said, "Jim, did the FDA brief you on Kratom?" And I said, "Yeah, they left here yesterday. I know today they're heading over to meet with Udom Dillon, the DEA administrator." And he said, "You need to stop before Udom Dillon, the DEA administrator, signs the ban." We were able to track Udom down at the airport, and Brett Giroir jumped in a car at HHS, went to the airport, pulled Udom into a conference room, and the discussion was the FDA got it wrong, and they didn't reveal the entire information. And as you've heard, Brett Giroir rescinded the FDA order because they were failing to tell the entire story. Again, I was there. I'm not the scientist. I'm just telling you what happened and what led to this. Since that time, and of course they rescinded it, we heard the information that in fact Kratom has been shown to help people with opioid addiction. And this isn't just during my time, even the current Secretary of Health for President Biden recently said that FDA needs to, the claims of addiction liability or fatalities caused by kratom are in fact caused by polydrug use or adulterated kratom products. Again, no bigger supporter of law enforcement. Directly out of my office, I funded $300 million to federal, state, local drug task forces across every state and across every jurisdiction of the United States. But what they're seeing on the street, I don't discount, but what we're actually seeing scientifically is the use of adulterated products. What I can tell you is that for whatever reason, and I think there's a lot of theories, the FDA has it wrong. We know the science has shown us that. And we know from Dr. Nora Volkoff at NIDA, who's been recognized as most powerful 50 women in the US because of her work across 4 presidents in leading NIDA, that this shows amazing potential to help people like my daughter get off opioids. And so for that, I wanted to come and express the facts of what happened. I was there during that time, and I wish you all luck. So with that, I think we're both happy to take any questions or go on for a couple of days if you would like.
Thank you both. Any questions for James or Curt? Representative Onstead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for your testimony. I remember 20 or 25 years ago reading the Wall Street Journal and reading a really small little article. I remember I think it was like 2 paragraphs. And it was like a big mystery because somebody had died in Appalachia, a coal miner, who had been hurt in an industrial accident. And he died of a heroin overdose, and of course that was after he couldn't get his opioids anymore. And then there was like another little paragraph right after it where a worker in the woods in Maine had also been hurt in an industrial accident and died of a similar overdose. And now, 25 years later, of course, we all know, where that has led. So it seems to me that, just the opportunity, the possibility that it's not just Suboxone, that there are things that we know can help people with their addiction to opioids. It seems to me, it leads me back to my decision after the last public hearing, that once again I'll be voting for this bill, and that's the reason why.
Any other questions for Curt or James? Seeing none, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Chair, one thing I neglected to point out in my testimony, if I may, very quickly. As a senator, I work I'm an honorary colonel with our Highway Patrol. Matter of fact, in my 24 years in the Senate, I've been probably one of the most consistent supporters of law enforcement. We went to our law enforcement, our public safety, and we've followed up with our the head of the Highway Patrol is called the superintendent of the Highway Patrol, head of public safety is called the commissioner, and the president of our Sheriff's Association happens to be the sheriff in my own county. And after we passed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act in 2019, I was genuinely interested in what has been the experience in the state of Utah, both with our Department of Agriculture in terms of administering and enforcing the KCPA, and what's been the experience with law enforcement. Surprisingly, our sheriff, when I asked him, he said, look, we understand that some law enforcement, we understand why they have concerns about kratom, and it has to do with how kratom is closely related to the drug culture. And that's because not only is kratom used for people trying to get off drug addiction, but it's also because, and quite often the cases are, the drug is spiked, it's adulterated with kratom. But in all cases with the Utah law enforcement, they have been very supportive of the bill, and they've been very supportive of the ability to get the adulterated products off the market. The FDA is not doing what they should be doing. It's left to the states, and this is a case across the board quite often. If the FDA would be doing their work then and looking at the science, we wouldn't be here today. But because they haven't, it's up to the states. 11 states have followed what we started in Utah. 30 states are looking at doing it now. But I wanted to emphasize that we've been working with law enforcement in our state, and we have not seen the problem, and your toxicology lab supported that, saying there wasn't one case where kratom was a sole issue with an OWI. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Next up, Jay Wentworth from Eagle River. And I would ask, Herbie, from moving forward here, that we